Welcome to another edition of the Empower Hour. I am Al Kumar. Hanifa is missing from the studio today. She won't be joining us. In the studio with us, we have Miss Sheila Brown. Miss Sheila Brown Speaks. She's going to be talking to us about eating disorders in our community, the epidemic of obesity, and how all that came about, which is a fascinating topic, the way she presents it, family. So you're in for some very, very interesting information. How are you, Miss Sheila?
I'm doing wonderful, Queen. How are you?
I'm great. Well, this is not your first rodeo on the Empower Hour.
This is not my first rodeo. I'm so glad to be back, though.
We're so glad to have you back for this topic,
Queen.
and so thankful for you taking your time out on this busy week for a lot of folks, and
My pleasure.
and especially as far as food is concerned.
You're right.
This is probably what the number one day for food
Consumption,
intake.
yeah, for overeating and emotional eating.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, good
Yeah.
point. But just so folks know who you are, give us a little bit of background about who you are and why you're best suited to talk about this subject.
Perfect. Thank you again for having me here. My name is Sheila Brown. I am a divine life strategist and a divine health coach. And my mission is to help women achieve a state of divine health so that they can get on with the business of fulfilling their divine purpose in life. And what that means is that I combine two very critical aspects of my experiences and my professional life. One, I'm a strategic planner and an attorney. And so realizing that planning and our divine life goals and our divine mission in life is directly connected to our health and our emotional, mental, and spiritual well-being, as well as our bodies, is what got me to this place of forming what I call Sheila Brown Speaks, which is the vehicle that I use to convey my ideas, my concepts, and my story. So my story is multi-layered, but the essence of the health portion is a gift of divine health that I initiated back in March of 2016, right when I was up close to wearing 300 pounds and feeling like I was on the verge of having a heart attack. And the symptoms that I was experiencing were very painful, and they were things that I could no longer ignore. Prior to that, I was able to, maneuver through life being unhealthy because I could still look nice in clothes. I was still shapely. I could garner a compliment every once in a while, and I can get through life. But when I started to experience this nagging shoulder pain and having these unexplainable sweat breakouts, I realized that in addition to the fact that I wasn't sleeping, and I was no longer able to participate fully in life. And the only thing that seemed to bring me pleasure was cooking and eating, mainly the eating portion. I began to rationalize my behavior by saying, well, my grandmother was a cook, my great-grandmother was a cook, I've always been really good at cooking, so it's just a natural extension that I would enjoy eating the cooking that I'm doing. And so I would often cook for a family of 8 when it would just be me and my son. And I really ate my way through life, and I wasn't even conscious of it, Queen. And this is why this is such a pivotal conversation, because I literally dealt with a very important and common issue that I believe exists among Black women, and I also theorize that it is the source of almost all of our diseases. And it's a surprising claim, but I'm going to do my best to prove it. And I believe that the issue that Black women in particular are facing more than anyone else in the world is an issue called loneliness. And it impacts our emotional well-being, our spiritual well-being, our financial well-being, our social standing, our political standing. It has a complete and devastating and comprehensive impact on every aspect of our entire lives. And it is all encompassing. And it is a simple word called loneliness.
Wow, wow, that's interesting to me. I took the liberty to look up the word or the meaning of food addiction.
Okay.
But I'm going to read it, and then I want you to fill in the gaps.
Okay.
Or change it if you see necessary. Food addiction refers to when the need to eat becomes compulsive or uncontrollable. This compulsive behavior may be in response to an emotion such as stress, sadness, or anger. The human body needs food to function, but food addiction is when a person becomes dependent on certain types of foods.
Mm-hmm.
What is your response to that description?
I don't have a problem with that description, but I will add to it that it's a very general description.
Okay.
And whenever we are looking at issues surrounding health and issues particularly surrounding food issues, it's designed to describe a very general portion of the population. Just like the diet community and just like the fashion community, it's designed to be universal. And usually being universal means that the most pertinent issues that affect Black women will not be addressed. So when you approach the issues around food addiction and what I call food substance abuse,
Oh, wow.
a coin that I have a term that I have coined, I should say, based off of my personal experiences with using food as a drug. So a substance abuser is basically someone who uses a substance in a harmful way that is intended to create a mood altering kind of purpose in their lives, right? And so when we think of substance, we tend to think about drugs, alcohol, illegal drugs often, but a substance can be anything. It could be glue. It could be cinnamon or nutmeg, and it can also be food. And unfortunately, food is accessible. Food is a common cultural component. It is a legal component, and it is something that is acceptable and something that everyone needs to do. So it's almost impossible to detect someone who is using food in a harmful way. Now, what makes it harmful is the fact that you are either using it in a way that it is not prescribed to be used, or you are overusing it in a way that it wasn't intended to be used. So when you eat a meal to nourish your body, that would be food substance use. It's something that you use to sustain yourself. It's not an addiction. It's not harmful. The point where you begin to develop a pattern of eating to cope with an emotion that is an unwanted emotion, that is triggered by an event that reminds you of something unpleasant, that relates to a particular kind of what I call emotional eating event. So, in my review of my own experiences, in my study, and in my spiritual discernment, I have devised a process for overcoming what I call emotional eating. And I'm not theorizing it. It's an actual system, a process, because I'm all about processes. As you can imagine, I'm a strategic planner, I'm an attorney, I think analytically, but I'm also a very spiritual person. And I recognized over the course of my own experiences that you cannot do the divine work you were sent here to do when your body is out of alignment with your purpose. Meaning, we have these physical bodies, which I call divine machines, that are meant to serve a purpose. And that purpose is to give our souls and our spirits the opportunity to fulfill an earth mission, an earthly goal. You need a physical body in order to do anything on earth. Otherwise, we consider that person deceased. in a worst case scenario, or in a less worst case scenario, they're incapacitated.
Mm-hmm.
But most people will tell you, even when you have a body that's functional, if it's not fully functional, if you're having problems with your colon, if you are having problems with your heart, it's very difficult. And even if you're having mental health issues, it's very difficult to get about the business of creating solutions in the world, of starting the business that you envision for yourself, or even being in relationship with people. So when I designed the program based off of my experiences and based off of what I observed and what I know to be science, the science that research has established, I have come up with an effective program that encompasses all of our relationships, the relationships that we have with the Creator, the relationship that we have with self, with family, with community, and in our case, with oppression, because that is a very important aspect of why we are lonely in the first place.
And I want you to dig a little bit more into that, how the whole emotional part of eating, the loneliness part, and how that relates to our journey here in this landmass, specifically, above and beyond any other African people.
Well, there is a very powerful term among the Ghanaian people that we know is the Adinkra symbol Sankofa, right? And we know that that means to go back and fetch it. Well, that principle is really a strategic planning principle, because in strategic planning, you have to take an assessment of what has already happened, your external environment, and you use that information intelligently, that data from the past, to assess where you are currently and design where you need to go and what obstacles you need to predict or to anticipate that you will need to overcome. And so when I looked at this African principle, I said the ancestors really knew what they were talking about. They had it down. So the Sankofa element is an important part of my program on how to overcome emotional eating. And when we examine Sankofa, I find it expedient to start with our journey and our sojourn in this country, unfortunately beginning with slavery, because our interaction with food as an oppressed people meant that food was used as a weapon. Food was used as a tool for punishment. It was a control mechanism, and it was also a way to dehumanize our ancestors. Queen Mother Harriet Tubman, who is one of my most astounding and favorite heroes, was a master strategic planner. But she was a woman with values, and she was a woman very clearly, early on, very wise in her age, in her spiritual awareness, about what I now call divinely prepared meals versus contentiously prepared meals, in my luxury of being a woman born in the 21st century and having the access to information. And what I have done is just broken down 2 categories of meal preparation. So when you have a divinely prepared meal, you have a meal that was prepared for you intentionally by someone who loves you and who means the best for you. Their intentions, like most of our ancestors' intentions, when they gathered the scrapings that were available to them, the hog maw or the collard greens and the fatback, the chitterlings, the pig ears, the snout and the toes, and whatever was available. What made the food that we now call soul food have any relevance to the community that they served was their intentions. In other words, the intention is a key ingredient in food, and I'm going to tell you why that's important. When Queen Mother Harriet Tubman was about 8 years old, she was hired out to the Cook family, which was a neighboring plantation owner. And they were so abusive and so cruel to her, and they beat her so viciously that she was terrified of them. And on occasions when they offered her milk, even though she was starving, even though she was more than likely emaciated, Queen Mother Harriet Tubman rejected that milk. She refused it. She outright said, no, I'm not taking that. Now, how could a little girl have the spiritual dignity, the food dignity and fortitude to reject what I call a contentiously prepared meal? And we, with all that we have access to, cannot use that same spiritual food dignity to decline what we know to be unhealthy and lacking in dignity towards us.
Why do you think that is, that we do that? We don't reject the foods that we know are not good for our bodies?
I think there are many reasons for it. I would like to say it's just ignorance, but a part of the reason why is indifference and a sense of hopelessness. In other words, in order for you to take your health seriously and to do what is necessary, the steps that I did and the women who are taking my current course are doing, you got to realize that you have a life worth living. Queen Mother Harriet Tubman knew she had a life worth living. And she knew she was entitled to certain things, including her dignity. And so even the temptation to satisfy the body with some sweet milk was unappealing to her, because she knew that the hand delivering the milk was a vicious hand. It was an uncaring hand. It was a contentious hand. And there was nothing nutritionally relevant in that milk that could override the fact that the person giving it to her had ill intentions for her.
How does the addictive part relate to our decisions to accept these types of foods or so-called foods that are harmful to us?
It has a huge part in it, but let's say this, because this is important. Prior to the 1960s, Black folk had a staple diet that usually consisted of green beans, collard greens, squash, okra, black-eyed peas. In fact, a study showed that in 1965, Black people were twice as likely to get the nutritional value that they needed out of their meals than white folks were.
Wow.
Fast forward 30 years later to 1995, the exact opposite was true. What was the difference? The difference was the inundation in the African communities in what they call urban ghettos back in the 60s of fast food operators.
Oh, wow.
And what is important to know, and what I teach the women in my course, is that this is social engineering. This is not the product of natural entrepreneurship. In other words, during Lyndon B. Johnson's administration, on the wake of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and in the midst of the riots, because between 1965 and 1968, there were some 300 odd riots between young African American youth and the police.
300?
There were some 300 riots between 1965 and 1968. And the community was devastated financially. You can imagine the scene. It was probably like a war scene. Burned out buildings, smoke even, constant turmoil, insecurity. And the government decided, that Lyndon B. Johnson specifically, that he would have to do something to address this issue and create economic opportunities. Well, if he did have good intentions, it was usurped by the people who saw what he was trying to do and decided that they were going to circumvent that to meet their own personal profiteering needs. And so what it ended up looking like was a Small Business Administration doing an assessment and saying they need economic opportunities, which is pretty obvious.
Is that the Kerner Commission report? I think, was that what that was about? When
I
they
don't
did the
know.
study and the research?
I don't know the name. I'm not familiar with that particular name. But what I do know is that there was a task force assigned after the riots, after the assassination of Dr. King, to see what could be done. And it was during the 60s. And so they decided that they were going to create economic opportunities through franchises, particularly. And the leading organization, the leading franchise behind this agenda was, believe it or not, Dunkin' Donuts. And so they decided that they were going to use the environment, the atmosphere, which meant that there was low rental property, there was no competition because there was retail redlining, meaning that other types of businesses should have been able to come into the communities and offer opportunities for jobs that would have been more lucrative for the people in the community, because as we know, fast food operators typically don't provide many management opportunities. There's maybe one or two per place. And so, but they masked all this in the form of entrepreneurship for urban Black ghettos.
Are you serious?
Yes. And so a handful of African American people, were able to get in on the goods by opening up their own franchises. But the majority of the Black community suffered. And not only did they suffer the insult of getting access to just low-paying jobs that usually weren't even enough to sustain themselves, so they had to get on nutritional supplement plans that we now call welfare. But it added the double insult of inundating our community with low nutritional value foods. What many people don't realize is that McDonald's became a D-quality kind of fast food restaurant after the late 60s and 70s, when they started appearing in Black communities. Prior to that, they were like the social place to be for young white socialites and teens when they were in suburban and rural communities, just like it took 20 years before Walmart started serving urban communities. So once the fast food restaurants, these large multinational chains, became high frequent presence in Black communities, they suddenly lost their value to the white communities. And so you started to see a distinction between the high quality chains that were kind of these foodie establishments that were in more affluent white communities, and then you saw what was considered the low chains. And you can tell the difference because they usually just had crude kitchens. They didn't offer much in area of seating. There wasn't much in terms of presentation. And so that became the characteristic of the fast food industry. In fact, McDonald's started their first campaign in the 70s, and their theme was "You deserve a break." And it was appealing to suburban middle class white children. It was a social place to hang out. It was a place to go get a quick meal and to be, jovial and have fun. But it was the complete opposite, and they wanted to now disassociate from that image. And so now what we have in almost every Black community are the fried chicken establishments and, of course, the popular chains that we now know of today, including McDonald's. Now, what makes this even more dangerous is because of the additives. People don't realize that the food is not being prepared by chefs. They're being prepared by scientists. In fact, they have been taking MRI scans of people eating things like Doritos and examining their brain waves while they eat certain foods to see what is called the bliss point, which is the exact amount of sugar, salt, and fat necessary to create addiction. So the bliss point is what you are really addicted to when you're eating your favorite chips or when you're eating your favorite foods. In fact, people have lost their minds over these, rotisserie chickens and over these charbroiled chickens from the so-called Peruvian environment. But really, what makes those foods appear to taste good is the MSG. The MSG on the foods expands the pores on your tongue, and it gives you a sensation that whatever you're eating is delicious and more appealing to your tongue than other foods are. And so you become addicted to that.
Hold that thought, because I want to jump in and add my own personal story, how I know that's a fact. When I first started weaning myself off of meat, this was several years ago, maybe about 10 years ago. And I remember one time riding past a McDonald's and I was hungry, smelling the McDonald's aroma, and my mouth started watering. I knew then that there was an addiction there. I was like, why is my mouth watering?
And that's another good point that you make, because it wasn't only your mouth watering, but it was your subconscious mind watering. So what people also need to understand is when you're in the car and you're driving and you're thinking about getting to your destination, and suddenly the radio comes on and you hear da 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 da, and you keep driving for a while, and then the next thing you know, you see the golden arches and your car suddenly is rearing in that direction. Well, that's a science. The companies are spending billions of dollars on advertisement and not food. They spend more money on the advertising process than on the actual quality of the food. Why? Because there is a return on your investment. When there was an experiment done by a psychologist named Maslow, and what he did was he tested his theory on a dog, and he blew this whistle several times a day, and every time he blew the whistle, he would put out a plate of food for the dog. And so the dog would hear the whistle and he would start salivating just because he associated the sound of the whistle with the food.
Wow.
This is a psychological principle, but psychologists are the ones who are behind the commercials, just like scientists are behind the food. You're fighting a battle that you cannot win. Because it is a battle of the mind, of the subconscious mind. So we are often driven to engage in behaviors by things we're not aware of. For example, if I ask you to spell the word spot, spell it for me.
S-P-O-T.
Now, what do you do when you come to a green light?
I want to say stop, but I know I don't supposed to. I know I don't supposed to, but I had to wrestle with that in my mind.
The reason you had
Wow.
to... Okay, let me try another one. And I'll explain to you why we're doing this. Okay, spell the word York.
Y-O-R-K.
Now, do this quickly. When I ask you this next question, just answer it. What do you call the white part of an egg?
Yolk.
The white part of an egg.
Oh, wow.
So do you see, just by planting the word
Wow.
York in your mind, your brain automatically did a computation that the yolk was the appropriate answer to the question that I didn't ask.
Wow.
I didn't ask you what's the yellow part of the egg called. Just like I didn't ask you what do you do when you come to a red light. I said, what do you do when you come to a green light? So what does that tell you? That your subconscious mind governs even your conscious mind. So when we think we're making decisions, are we really?
And that's the part of the mind we really don't understand as we should, because and I know we don't because of the decisions we make.
Yeah, and not only that, and how it relates to emotional eating. So if you Googled emotional eating, you're going to come up with tons of different information. I like to simplify things.
Yeah.
And so I have determined that there are basic 3 responses to eating. First of all, when I design my course and call it How to Overcome Emotional Eating, I do play on the fact that most people tend to think of emotional eating as something that is negative. But there's basically 3 types of emotional eating events, and all of us are emotional eating. No one sits down and looks at a plate of food and has no feeling whatsoever. You're thinking, this is good, or you're thinking, God, I'm late for work, or you're thinking, I've never had anything like this. Is this real meat? You know, there's all kinds of emotions that occur when you're eating. So there are 3 types of emotional eating that I teach about, and they're basically this. There is positive impulse emotional eating, negative emotional eating, and then there's balanced emotional eating. Which one do you think you should be doing most of the time? Balanced emotional eating. So what the issue is when we talk about emotional eating, and I speak to ladies all the time when I'm trying to introduce my course to them, they say, oh, I'm not an emotional eater. I don't have that problem. But we're all emotional eatings. For example, when your girlfriends get together or there's a birthday party, that is a trigger to eat. And it's usually something that you weren't planning to do. Sometimes it is, but that's a positive impulse emotional eating event, meaning that it's associated with good feelings, wonderful feelings. It's not necessarily a bad thing. The negative emotional eating triggers is what's the issue. That's when you have a trigger by something, an event, something that causes a reminder that creates an unwanted feeling in you. And then you want to cover that feeling. And you cover that feeling, if you are an emotional eater, with usually a high carb food or a sugary food or a salty food.
Why? Why those 3?
Accessibility, addiction, and ease of access. So accessibility, addiction, and taste. It's very pleasurable. And then there's a hormone that's released when you eat something pleasurable in your brain called dopamine. And that hormone makes you feel good. It sends wonderful feelings to your body. So what this brought up for me, and I'll explain to you how I came to discover about negative impulse emotional eating. When I first did a 60-day juice fast, that's a good way to find out that you have a food addiction. And I think I told you this story before. I was fine during the week because I was at work, no issues. Life is good. I was making money. I was busy. The problem came when the weekend came. Now, my son was of age, and he wasn't playing that I'm going to be in the house watching movies with you all day. So it was the weekend. I was doing my juice fast, and I thought everything would be fine. I had my normal routine, covering up my loneliness of, getting a movie and surrounding myself with food. So I would have popcorn, I'd have ice cream, I'd have yogurt, I'd have Raisinets, I might have some M&Ms, I might have some nuts. I might even have a meal on top of that. And it would be laid out around me because in my mind, I was saving money. I wasn't going to the movies and I was enjoying myself. I wasn't bothering anybody, right? And so that would be my typical weekend. And so unaware that I was beginning to wear all that on my body through fat, that I had almost accumulated a whole person, it came to me when I did the same routine, because when you're doing a kind of long-term juice fast, your life goes on, you still go to work, the weekends come, you still think you're going to do the same things. And so that weekend came, I had the video and I laid all I would have laid out the food around me. This is still how real it still feels for me, that I would still be in that place. And so the only thing that I didn't have was the movie, and I think I began to watch the movie and I probably instinctively just tried to reach for something like popcorn, and I realized there was no food there. And I was going to have to do this entire weekend that was just getting started alone. And it caused me to have probably what many people would classify as a nervous breakdown. I almost lost myself in the house that night. It was early and I just could not imagine how I was going to make it through without having that food. And it was a very uncomfortable sensation for me. It was a very hard night. I cried. I was so frustrated. I was so angry, and I did not understand why. And it didn't dawn on me what I was going through at the time. But having to endure that night, that weekend, was such a critical point in my life and in my test of getting to a state of divine health, that it formed for me the purpose of having the course on how to overcome emotional eating.
Wow.
Because if I did not have the spiritual fortitude to get through that night, I would probably be in a different place than I am right now. And so I honor my contracts with myself, and that's the only thing that saved me. But there was another presence in that room, and it was daring me. How dare you think you're going to do a juice fast? Who do you think you are? It was like a wrestling entity in that space with me, and it was hard. It was really, really hard, and that's when I realized, okay, so this food has meant something else to me. Now, that revelation came to me because almost a year later, when I had met most of my weight loss goals, because it took me 15 months to drop 135 pounds once I got clear about what I needed to do, which was a combination of juice fasting, exercise, high water intake, and intermittent fasting. All God's tools, all natural. And I really go through that in my course on how to overcome emotional eating. But one day I was at a coffee shop. Life was going good. I was feeling good about myself. And I left the coffee shop and I proceeded to get to my car, and there was a young man sitting at a table, and he asked me if he could speak to me for a minute. And so I was like, okay, be nice. So I went over, we had a short discourse, and I went on about my business, and I got in the car and I proceeded to drive off. But instead of heading home to do what I said I was going to do, I found myself headed towards the pizza shop. And I could not.
And this was after your fast.
This is after I had lost that 135 pounds, and I was doing my thing. But I said, why am I going to a pizza shop? And it was something that I could not break. And I actually had to pull over because I could not get past this need, this sudden urge to eat something. I had to eat something specific. I could see it, I could taste it, I could barely get there. And it was a pizza, and it was a greasy pizza, and they had vegan pizza too with gluten free. So I knew where I could go to get this fix that I needed. But the problem was, and this is why I teach women that you have to have a plan, because my plan for the day didn't call for this event. And so I was saying, well, why do I feel this need to go satisfy myself in this way? And why such a specific thing? So I pulled my car over and I said, okay, Sheila, what happened right before this popped up? And I kind of replayed the events in my mind, and I thought, well, I wasn't feeling this when I left out of the coffee shop, but as soon as I got in my car, I got this urge. And I thought back to the conversation I had with a young man, and that conversation triggered something for me. What it triggered was loneliness.
Wow.
It reminded me that, yeah, you got some great things going on for yourself, but don't ever forget you're lonely still.
Wow.
Don't ever forget it. And so you're going to have to deal with this loneliness. You're going to have to smother it. And so loneliness in this romantic sense for me came up as something heavy, right? Like sex is a heavy, it's a sensual, it's oily. If it were a food, right? What better food than a cheesy, oily, greasy, heavy pizza, right? And so that's why that specific food came up as opposed to popcorn, which is really my weakness, or as opposed to ice cream or yogurt, all of which come in plant-based versions. So just being vegan and being disciplined doesn't mean, I had already, as far as I was concerned, mastered intermittent fasting, mastered my plant-based life. So this was something else that was coming back up, and it took me right back to that first weekend.
Wow.
And that was when I meditated on it, and I got the revelation that this is an emotional eating disturbance that you had, and it was triggered by something. So I started doing my research, I started meditating on it, and I started paying close attention to all the times that I would feel a sudden urge to eat outside of hunger, outside of my planned meals. Now, this would have never come up for me if I didn't have a plan set for my day and my life. So having a purpose-driven life is the antidote to overcoming emotional eating.
Wow. Well, how much is understanding too, though, helpful to overcoming it? Because I'm listening to you break these things down so eloquently, and hearing things that I never considered before. So it's like, how effective would it be if more of us understood it in this way? Then I think that we would probably have better tools to be able to overcome a lot of these obstacles if we knew what you know.
First of all, it would be a revolution.
Mm.
It would be a revolution.
Mm.
Because let me tell you this, Queen. There are no fast food restaurants that I can even imagine going into for any other reason than using the restroom. It doesn't even show up as food on my radar. They're in your cravings for it.
Right.
Because now that I know why those fast food restaurants are there and how they got there, as opposed to, let's say, a jeweler, or as opposed to an Office Depot, or as opposed to a high quality restaurant that exposes you to organic foods, or a farmer's market, or a lab that operates on some high scientific level. Why fast food restaurants? Why so many? Once I figured that out and I traced it back to our plight against racism and oppression in this country, and the solution that they came up with that was both profitable for them and at the same time devastating for us, because we got to remember, outside of the fact that you had the devastating assassination of one of our best heroes, we also had the introduction of crack cocaine. Right?
I'm glad you used that word introduction.
Yeah, the introduction of crack cocaine, because it appeared in our community as opposed to paper clips or broccoli. We never have just an infestation of baking soda or laundry detergent.
Teach on that.
Right? Or something like contact lens solution, but magically we get crack cocaine, and it throws the death blow on the Black woman who operates at an emotional level, and whose men were being attacked at a physical level and being taken away from us. And so this is why I'm unapologetic about using the term Black women when it comes to this, because although I'm sure many people could benefit from what I have learned and what I have known, no one is dealing with this issue of loneliness because of economic, financial, and spiritual oppression like Black women do. And it is unfair to force Black women to have to try to figure out why they can't be successful in doing something like one of the popular diet plans. It's not that they don't have what it takes, but they're dealing with a whole nother level of issues.
Wow.
And layers of issues. Transitional housing, homelessness, rape, sometimes family disputes that just go beyond the normal discourse of I'm not talking to you, but really heavy things that are on the plate, job insecurity, all manner of things that are constantly bombarded with. And so the solution is to return to what Queen Mother Harriet Tubman was. Do you know that Queen Mother Harriet Tubman fasted every Friday?
Wow.
People are offended about the movie about Queen Mother Harriet Tubman for all the wrong reasons. The real insult in that movie was that, one, they made it seem like her first trip to freedom was a hitchhike ride by a woman who just so happened to be lucky enough to catch all of the right rides in all the right, unaccompanied barns. That was an insult to Queen Mother Harriet Tubman. It was an arduous journey, that first journey for her. It was a long journey and it was a hard one. And I think the one thing that popped out for me first in the movie was the fact that she fell off of the river, and that was seeming like the hardest thing. And then after that, she caught a series of rides. Even the biggest insult was that someone offered to ride her over the line into freedom. That was the real insult in that movie. That Queen Mother walked her way. She slept nights. She probably fought off snakes and coyotes. She had to deal with mites. But what she also had under her tool belt was knowledge, because her father had the privilege and insight of living off of the land. And he taught her everything he knew, and he was the one who instilled in her the benefits of fasting. And her mother was a cook, and so she knew about sassafras. She knew how to identify black cherry. She knew how to identify poisonous versus non-poisonous. She knew how to look at the bark of a tree and identify which direction she was going in. That's the part that they missed.
Wow.
That magic that happened, the divinity of her first flight and each one thereafter.
Wow.
That's the real insult. But I say all that to say, what we have to return to is weaponizing our body. See, her body was her weapon. She went against cold nights with no food. Some of the stories, if you read her only authorized biography that she had by Sarah Bradford, you would break down in tears just thinking about what she endured and what she experienced and what the people endured. It was just incredible. Incredible. And food was never a priority when it came to freedom. Food was never a priority.
If you guys are just joining us, we are in a fascinating discussion with Sheila Brown Speaks. And wow, I'm just blown away by your knowledge and your wisdom on this subject matter.
Thank you, Queen.
But why not the men? I hear you say the women, it's so important for the women, but hasn't our brothers been through some stuff too?
Absolutely, absolutely. There's two reasons why I focus my Divine Health program on women and Black women. One is because a lot of my food experiences trigger for me sexual memories, and I have a difficult time. It's a self-limiting belief. It's nothing against the brothers. I personally have a difficult time opening up in the way that I need to around what is happening around food with men. So it's not that men don't need it, but there is some research and some science. Brothers don't respond in the same way to the health crisis in the way that it impacts women. In other words, under the same circumstances, men typically don't have the same levels of obesity that we have as a result of fast food and emotional eating.
Interesting.
Yeah, they don't, their bodies are different. We internalize everything.
Yeah.
And so I feel in many ways they wouldn't be able to relate to what it is that I do and what I experience as a woman.
Yes.
And so
Michael, can you hit that button? I'm sorry.
no problem.
Yeah.
And so,
turn them out to the front and hit the end button. Yeah, okay, thank you. Sorry.
and so that's my own self-limiting belief. It's just easier for me to connect with women on that emotional level. I'm not saying that all of my food events were, trauma or anything like that, but the way I connect with the women, it's very, very deep and very emotional, and it's very feminine. But the divine purpose aspect of it, I do feel comfortable with men. In fact, I have been getting a lot more response from my work and my desire to work with people on developing their strategic life plan from men than from women. Maybe that's a more masculine principle in that whole analytical thing of processing your environment and things like that. Women get it, but it's not as appealing. So the Most High is working with me on that.
Yeah. Okay. I noticed when you said it, we don't relate to food the same. Our bodies don't with men. But I noticed that my recent trip to Zimbabwe, I didn't see a lot of obesity there, like I do here among Black women. Why do you think that is?
It might be a lot of reasons, but mainly they probably haven't been inundated with fast food restaurants yet, where the preservatives and the additives create the addiction, and they probably are still, I don't know where you were, but they were probably in careers or occupations that did a lot of physical movement, and I don't want to be presumptive and saying people don't sit in offices, but they're also very close to the earth, and their food is pure.
Yeah, that they are.
And they have access to their original food. So we're not eating food, we're eating food product. And the meat that we are consuming isn't meat. It's not real animals. And this is something that I tell sisters all the time, because different people from different religious experiences feel like they should be able to eat meat. And I don't have a problem with that if that's a part of your religious experience. But I would like to bring to your attention, you don't have access to meat anymore. The creatures that you are being served in these grocery stores, they're not the animals that was spoken of in Genesis.
That's real.
These are human growth hormone infused animals. These are genetically modified animals. These are animals that may have been dead for 13 years, stock up in some freezer before it gets to you. And because food is distributed by zip codes, there's even no more telling what you're getting access to. So the argument that it's to fulfill a sacred purpose to eat a certain kind of an animal or meat, I would argue that the Most High is aware that you don't control your source of agriculture, including food. And so you need to be mindful of the fact that you're living in a very strange time with very strange people.
Absolutely.
Who are controlling the means to everything, including what you eat. And so the best thing that you can do is operate from what I call a place of defensive eating and offensive eating, meaning that this is where I talk about the scientific portion of the things that I teach my women about what I call a few tools, which is understanding how to manipulate the natural elements, earth, fire, air, and water. And what I teach them first is that when you're dealing with earth, so most of what is the defensive posture that we can take is free. Queen Mother Harriet Tubman and Queen Mother Harriet Jacobs, my other favorite woman in the world, and she has some incredible food stories. And I'll tell you a few of her food stories, but they didn't have access to groceries. They didn't have access to the food that they wanted, but they had the ability to interpret their experiences in their own favor. In other words, these women had internal locus of control. They accepted responsibility for their reaction to the environment and circumstances that they lived in. And so instead of saying they were starving, they fasted. Excellent. And they conditioned their bodies to be able to manage without food. They did it intentionally. This is how Queen Mother Harriet Jacobs was able to sit in a roof on top of her mother's shack for 7 years to deceive the master. And that was without access to clean air, access to the things of every human being's deserving life.
Mind over matter.
Mind over matter.
Wow, that's deep. Popeye's chicken. I want to bring up two things about that I heard that made me stop and think twice. One, somebody mentioned to me that they were in a neighborhood that most of us do not reside, and they didn't notice what they noticed at the Popeyes, it was empty, and they drove through a neighborhood where most of us reside, and the lines was around the corner. I found that fascinating. Somebody else mentioned that there's lines like Slutty Vegan, this new vegan restaurant, I believe it's in Atlanta, where they have lines wrapped around the corner all day, every day. Mm-hmm. But you never hear anything about people fighting and shooting and killing each other and, all that stuff. Waiting in line for vegan food versus a Popeye's chicken sandwich. Mm-hmm. What's your thoughts on this phenomenon we have around this chicken sandwich?
I want to choose my words carefully on this. There's a self-respect component, but there's something even bigger than that. I don't see it any different than someone going to eat at a place that's named after the type of music that you preference at the time. So imagine going into Saudi Arabia as a black woman and opening up, and I don't mean to be offensive, but going into an established, let's say, Afghan community and opening up camelback falafels. Do you think that the Afghan people would patronize your shop, or do you think that you would find yourself probably killed or run out of town at the best? Right? So somewhere along the line, whatever Queen Mother Harriet Tubman had in terms of food dignity and understanding contentious meals, the same concept that I have, it's no different from going into a cage where someone has a bulletproof barrier between you and them, and handing them your money and expecting them to give you nutritional food that is suitable for your human life. We have become so dehumanized. We are so traumatized. We are so out of our minds that those are not consciously healthy people, even though they may have nice cars, even though they may have nice clothing, even though they may come from another area of living. When you are seeing people engage in self-hatred behavior, where they can't even assess what is happening in their environment, they can't interpret the events that are happening around them, they can't look around and see that there's a threat in their environment. You're not dealing with healthy individuals. It's a form of mind control. It is a form of self-hate, and it is a deadly combination of subliminal messaging, subconscious behavior, self-hatred, and a need to engage in emotional eating. So it's so much easier to go and expend the energy that you should be using to fight economic oppression, political oppression, police oppression. It's so much easier to go douse all of that bigness away with a meal when you are a man or a woman, right?
Wow.
It is emotional eating at a collective level. It is suicide. It is a way to avoid dealing with the need to deal with strategic planning, which is really about effective management of time and change. Who wants to deal with that when you can drown out what's happening around you, drown out what you can't control or what you don't want to confront with addictive foods?
Wow. Going back a little bit, and we're running out of time, but I did want to ask this. You said something earlier about when you were wrestling with that entity inside of that room that night, you had the epiphany. I'm wondering, is that possible why so many of us choose not to go that route? Because the route of eating healthier or fasting or just doing what we know is the necessary steps to get to a more healthier existence, but we don't. And we make excuses not to, because maybe somewhere in the deep crevices of our mind, we know that wrestling is going to take place and we don't want to confront it.
Mm-hmm. Definitely it does. It's a subtle emotion, but it is the need to cover, right? It's the need to cover, and it can come up in the form of crack cocaine. But we have conditioned ourselves to be repulsed by a crack addict. We have conditioned ourselves to accept obesity and chronic obesity. We glamorify it. We say that's sexy. We call it thick. We call it anything. And then the same outfit.
PHAT.
The same outfit that you can get in a size 2 to 8 to 12, you can get all the way up in a 36 or a triple X when they can't identify it anymore. In fact, I remember being so big one day, I went into a store looking for a bra and I couldn't find it, and they said, oh, go over to that shop over there, they sell things for large women. And I went in that shop and I was excited because nothing was there to remind me of my obesity. In fact, the way they arranged the sizes was 1, 2, and 3. So if you were between a size, let's say 16 and 20, you were a 1. If you were a 22 to a 26, you were a number 2. And if you were a 28 to a number 30 or 32, you were just a 3. So here I am, I'm like, hey, I'm a 1. And I was feeling sorry for the 3s, right? So in other words,
that's that science you just got finished talking about.
It's the interpretations. And so I know what it is to be a voluptuous woman. I know what it is to be healthy and to be thick and to be attractive, but I also have to contend with the fact that I've got arteries. And there's laws of the universe and laws of the earth. And so you're walking around in heels and you're 300 pounds, that's going to have an impact on your knees. It's having an impact on your heart. It's not just your physical body that's at stake. I think the most devastating thing is that when you see an unhealthy mother, you're also seeing 2 to 3 generations of unhealthy people. We all have a food story, and the ladies in my course, they develop their own food story, and it's hard for people to understand the significance of this exercise at first, but it's really taking a historical look at all of the events that happen in your present life and examining how they impact food. You know, what is the relationship between food? For example, one thing that I have found over the years that's common to little girls is this thing that they're taught about quid pro quo when you're as early as 6 months old, 2 months old. As soon as you start being able to handle solid foods, this comes up, where someone extends their lips to give you a kiss. And you're a baby, you don't want to kiss, you're a toddler, it's terrible to you, you're not interested in kissing anyone. But then what they do is they then extend to the little girl, it's almost always a little girl, a lollipop, a piece of candy. And so then you've got my attention as a 2-year-old. But as I go to reach for the lollipop, you snatch it back behind your back and you put your lips out. And then everyone around you is encouraging you to go in for the kiss so that you can get the lollipop. So the principles of prostitution are being ingrained in you as early as your toddler years. Isn't that what you're giving? Something physical, something intimate in exchange for currency? What's the currency of a 2-year-old? A lollipop. What's the currency of a woman? Money. What does the holder decide is the value of my kiss is a lollipop? The holder of the money decides that the value of whatever sexual service might be $20 or $2,000.
Wow, family. Well, we have less than 2 minutes left, and we're talking to Sheila Brown Speaks, but we definitely about eating disorders and food addictions, and as it relates to Black women. Please share with the audience how they can get more information from you. And I know you have a book, maybe 2 now, right? 2 books out there. Share with them how they can gain that information, please.
Well, I want to encourage everyone to visit my website, SheilaBrownSpeaks.com, because this topic that I really didn't go into as much as I really wanted to about contentious meals versus divinely prepared meals It's a very important one because the intentionality behind the food that you eat drives in part your need to feel satisfied or your lack of it, because there's two sides to human hunger. There is a physiological side that addresses the fullness, and then there is a spiritual side that addresses the contentment. And when you go to fast food restaurants, or even when you eat a meal prepared by someone who is not desiring to cook for you, you're eating what I call a contentiously prepared meal. But I introduced the concept in my free ebook called Divinity Soup, an ancestor inspired recipe. You can go to SheilaBrownSpeaks.com and download that book for free. It's a short read, it's a sweet read, and it has a wonderful recipe for a vegan, gluten-free collard green stew or soup. It's just incredible. So I would really recommend you do that. And it's also a great way to get to understand a little bit more about me and my story and what qualifies me to do what I'm doing. I am not a woman who has studied this as a profession. I have lived it. I have moved through it. I have walked through it. I have endured it. I have done it. And I have studied it. So I stand clear on my values and on my processes. Now, the other thing I would ask you to do is to look up my book on Amazon called Sometimes Raw, Sometimes Cooked, Always Divinely Prepared. That is a book that is a charge for it. It's $15, but I tell you the returns in that book are going to be incredible, because when you get the book, you're going to learn more about how to develop your own divinely prepared meals. You're going to get 21 vegan-based recipes that are gluten-free and or plant-based recipes or vegan recipes, and you're going to learn how you can remove 96% of the pesticides from conventional vegetables without spending lots and lots of money, because sometimes people cannot afford organic. And so there's a formula in there based off of a study that was done out of the University of Michigan that explained that if you use a certain household ingredients for 30 minutes, you can actually remove 96% of the conventional pesticides, and there's over 66 pesticides usually found on conventional vegetables and fruit. And then I would also encourage you to consider signing up for the next edition of my course on how to overcome emotional eating that's starting on January 2nd. You can send me an email at info@SheilaBrownSpeaks.com. info@SheilaBrownSpeaks.com.
Right.
And is it .com after Outlook account? I can't remember. It might not be .com, but it's info@SheilaBrownSpeaks. And I can set up a call with you, or you can visit me on Instagram. And if you click the link in my bio, then you will be able to access several links to my website and to the calendar to set up a call to find out if you're appropriate for my first course on how to overcome emotional eating. I'm doing the second edition of it, and I think you'll really enjoy it. This course is for anyone who eats, really, but particularly Black women and women who have children, women who have a relationship that they know is unhealthy with food, and they want to do something about it and do it naturally. You have everything you need to do. Bariatric surgery is not your only option. There's just a lot that you can do that is available to you, and we're going to take you on a journey to divine health that way.
All right, family. What better time? What better time to get control of our eating habits than the day before Thanksgiving?
Break it down.
Before the day before Thanksgiving. So I just asked you guys that, when you're around the table tomorrow, just consider what you heard today. Play this video back and, watch it more than once. Reach out to Sheila, because as you can see, she's a wealth of information. And she can help us get better. So that's all I have for you this week. And until next time, take care of each other out there. Peace.
Peace and blessings, fam.